Good evening. So it is really hard to talk about literacy in 23-24 without hearing about something called structured literacy. It's a hot topic right now. It is something that we were asked to touch on tonight, so we want to share a little bit about what this is, what it means. Starting with the fact that the International Dyslexia Association actually was the first organization to coin this term back in 2016. So depending on your perspective, that was a long time ago or not that long ago. I can't decide for me which. But when you have a new term coined like this, people talk, and there can be a lot of understanding that is facilitated, and there can be a lot of misperceptions that grow. And so we're going to stay really close to the original coining of the term from the International Dyslexia Association. That's why it's hyperlinked on this slide for you, so you can click to it. Their white paper was updated in 2021, but still stands. So that's where we're holding close to that. And I want to start by telling you a little bit about what structured literacy is not, and then we'll get into what it was intended to be through this white paper. A big misperception that we see all across the county and the state, and even nationally sometimes, is that structured literacy is not a program. Structured literacy is not just about decoding, word recognition, phonics. Structured literacy does not just have to do with early reading development. Those are things that are misperceptions. And we're going to dig into the research a little bit and show structured literacy approaches are intended to be designed for all areas of reading across all the grade levels of reading. So the instructional approach is dynamic, changes because of what it means. So you know, what really does it mean? Structured literacy is coined initially to put the integrate or talk about instructional approaches that integrate the research on how reading develops across time. So it's basically putting the research into practice. And I think the timing is interesting too, 2016. That is exactly the year that our essential instructional practices for early literacy were first being released. So there was this convergence of evidence emerging from the field, and organizations were putting out guidance around that. So when we think about structured literacy, we want to think about instructional approaches that integrate listening, speaking, reading, and writing, right? If I can't write what I can't say, and if I'm not going to understand something when I read it, if I don't understand it when I hear it, then it makes sense that we are talking about instructional approaches that really map speaking and listening to reading and writing. So that's one of the big principles about structured literacy approaches. They also emphasize the structures of our language, of our English language, across systems like the sounds that we say. It's called phonology. The orthography, the way that we write words and spell. The morphology, the meaningful parts of our language. If you're a speech and language pathologist, I see some of you, you know all this stuff. This was our graduate school. It is about knowing how our language builds word meanings and parts of meanings, semantics. We put words together to make sentences, syntax, and we have engaged in extended discourse for topics and ways of speaking and listening and reading and writing. So that is the big idea about what these approaches are based on the reading research about how reading develops across time. So studied some research, and then we put some ideas about what instruction based on that research would look like. And so it's behind me on the slide. It's things like there is an explicit, systematic approach. We don't rely on kids to infer or try to draw conclusions about what we mean. We would be telling, showing, practicing together, and engaging with a level of intensity and consistency so that kids get really good at these things and then can do them with mastery without us. The scopes and sequences of these approaches are very systematic so that earlier skills are presented before later skills. Kids learn beginning skills before they learn skills and strategies that come after that. Instructional approaches would have formative assessment monitoring systems that ideally would be quite efficient and effective and not take away from instructional time, but would be adding to instructional time. There's a lot of opportunities for student response. The frequency is high. Kids are engaged with each other. There is a lot of talking with at the same time, really, rather than a one-by-one approach. It's quite interactive and active. And then there's immediate feedback provided by teachers and peers. And then, again, like I said earlier, I mentioned the focus is not just on foundational skills in these approaches, but also on higher level language skills comprehension as well. So that is how we're going to frame structured literacy based on where that term first came from. All right. Okay, great. So, what about kids who are struggling to learn to read? Kids who may have dyslexia, kids who might be learning multiple languages at one time. How does our approach connect with, change, stay the same when we're engaging with those kiddos? And so what the research has borne out again and again, and we see in a variety of places, are Michigan essential practices for early literacy, are the national guides, they call them the Institute for Educational Science Practice Guides, IES guides for short, our Michigan Dyslexia Handbook, is that when explicit, systematic core instruction bridges, integrates speaking, listening, reading, writing, and emphasizes language structure, it's beneficial for all kids, but is especially critical for kids who struggle. So it hurts no one, and it's especially helpful for our kids who are struggling. And so I want to talk just a little bit about, actually, if you go back one, okay, you just kick me if I'm taking too long.
No, you're good.
All right, so I want to go back to this and just say kids struggle for a variety of reasons, okay? We might have kids who have very intact decoding skills. They pick up the code very quickly, but they struggle with oral language. Their vocabulary, their grammar, their ability to make inferences could be an instructional need. Conversely, we might see kids who have strong oral language skills and are really struggling to learn how to decode. And then you might see kids who have trouble in both of those areas. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But what I want you to consider is that when we have effective instructional systems being delivered that is comprehensive and effective, and what I mean by that is that most, close to all kids are learning on time. They're learning, getting to the outcomes in the time frame we want. Then we know that our kids who struggle, we're going to layer intervention on top of that quality core instruction they've already gotten. So they're more likely to make connections between what they're learning in intervention and how they're connecting it in the classroom. They are going to accelerate their learning, and intervention will take less time and be more effective. So although right now there is not empirical evidence that identifies, oh, this structured literacy set of materials has it going on, this is all you need, does not exist out there. But what we know from the research is that these instructional strategies, which are embodied in your local practice guidance documents, are what kids learn most effectively with, especially our kids who have struggling needs or might be learning multiple languages. Okay, now we're going to get to this. So dyslexia is usually at the heart of this. I mean, I just framed the conversation with the white paper from the International Dyslexia Association. So why is it such a centerpiece of the conversation? And before I talk about that, I just want to clarify what we mean when we say dyslexia. So as defined in our MDE handbook, dyslexia is really, if you go back to the slide in the model Suzanne showed, if we think about, I mean, you can stay on this page, it's just a reference that The blue visual should look sort of familiar. Dyslexia is really difficulties primarily in that word recognition decoding part of the reading process. Very strong oral language, vocabulary, comprehension skills. And this is kind of crucial, it's identified when kids have been exposed to, engaged with effective instruction in word recognition and decoding and comprehension and oral language, but they have not learned those decoding and word recognition skills, okay? So there's some instruction that's come before it. It is one of our most common learning disorders. It occurs anywhere from 1 in 5 individuals, so it's quite common. And I want to talk a little bit about how common it is in Oakland County. But before I do that, the bottom part of the graph, if you were to look at language comprehension, you also could have kiddos, I mentioned, who are just struggling with the comprehension side. We got strong word recognition skills, but they struggle with language. Those kids are not dyslexic. Those kids are called language impaired. So if you have heard speech language impairment, language, that's what we're talking about there. Also very common in our county, in our state, in our nation. So if you think about the difficulties in I'll just say in our county average, about 11 to 12% of our student count are identified as having an IEP. That means a delay that interferes with their progress in general ed and requires specially designed instruction, between 11 and 12% countywide. Out of those kids with IEPs, over 50% are as a result of specific learning disability or language impairment. So this is a big deal. And so the reason why talking about this instruction and the approach we use is that if our core instruction includes this comprehensive, grade appropriate, effective instruction, we know that all kids are going to benefit, and we know that kids who will struggle are going to be easier to find because they're not responding, and we're going to be able to intervene quickly. So, all right, instructional approaches. Our next slide. Okay, great. A couple of trends that people wanted to know about, and so we're going to talk about this at a county level. We see across the county the biggest push in the last, almost 7 years now since the instructional practices came out, was a push towards building up our professional knowledge, our skill set, our understanding, our implementation of the essential practices out of MAISA and the General Education Leadership Network. So lots of training and support there. These are the evidence-based practices that align right with that research that we've talked about. And really, it's interesting, the front of the document, it talks about this is a minimum standard of care. These 10 practices implemented daily have been shown to improve outcomes for our kiddos. So those go hand in hand, the evidence-based and the essentials. Districts are taking advantage of state opportunities for support of that professional learning, as well as providing their own supports with instructional coaches, using MDE. They have guided some of this implementation and the networking opportunities. Districts we see are reviewing their curriculums. They're engaging in processes and procedures to say what is our local data showing us, what does our curriculum look like, do we have a good match, are most if not all of our kids meeting our expectations within the timeline that we want. So, and I believe that when you look at some of the data from the Literacy Essentials Oakland project and a big study of what curriculum materials are being used in the state, it's called the EPIC study, 60 to 80% of districts statewide have been looking to round out, update, supplement the resources that they're using in core instruction. So it's a common theme. Staffing and resource allocation, we've seen a lot of resource go towards coaching. We also have looked at, when you look at the numbers, now I work in special education, so I'm always thinking about, what do our supports to our kiddos with IEPs need, but this is a big chunk of the students with IEPs in any district are struggling with language and reading and writing. So allocation has actually increased in a lot of districts for those staff members. And then the systemic approach, and we can just click to the next slide here, please, thanks. So the Literacy Essentials also has like a system-wide, organization-wide essential practices. It goes right into this. We're looking at systems, and I know that we don't have to say this to you guys because you drive your system, but a lot of times, I think old thinking was, well, what material do we choose? What intervention? I've been a long-time member of our multi-tiered system of support team, and the most common question we get, what intervention? What's the menu? Like, what's going to work? Without really looking at the system-wide components that you see on the screen. Obviously, professional learning, you have to be able to apply what people are trying to innovate. You have to be able to have support. You have to have a culture behind you of trust and safety and belonging, and you're engaging in all of these things you see here. The systems piece is very crucial. So a lot of times we try to go fast because it's urgent, and we can't forget this part, and sometimes that feels like going a little slower, but it's important to pull it off. All right.
I actually have a quick question there. So I think what you described, it makes a lot of sense. I think it hits home with a lot of people in our community, so I really appreciate how you explained it from the structure standpoint. I actually think a lot of people in our community are going to walk away feeling very positive about what you just explained. So I would really ask the question, because I know there's a lot of pushback on that side, what is the actual cons to the structured system?
Yeah, and I will leave it up to you. I know that they've asked for us to complete these, and I don't know if that's part of your presentation that's coming up or not, but to fill out the cards.
I think that's a fair question to ask in our community. I think we'd like to answer it. It's not overly technical. She obviously knows what she's talking about. I'm just asking generally, what do you hear are the cons to what you described? Because what you all described, I think, sounded really well. I think our community's going to walk away going, why aren't we doing that? I would just think if there are legitimate cons that we should be aware of, if you could provide any of those.
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. I think we are being asked to stick to the process of the questions on the cards. So if that's okay, if we can stick with that, then we can have it in writing and get you the information that you need.